There are 108 poems that illuminate a hidden landscape in the names of children killed in the 2008 Sichuan earthquake. Many of their deaths could have been prevented if not for the shoddy construction of the school buildings in which they attended. The poems are inspired by an exhibit that Ai Weiwei created and an investigation he led in an effort to restore the names of the children who perished. Of the author of this new book entitled A Forest of Names, Ai Weiwei said, Ian Boyden is not just a poet, he is an artist, craftsman, translator, and rebel. And to call him the poet or the author of A Forest of Names is a disservice because these poems are translations of the names of the dead children and short meditations of those names. It is a project that could only have been undertaken by someone fluent in English and Chinese, fluent in the Buddhist tradition, and also well-versed in the quality of empathy, so rare in our contemporary world and in contemporary poetry. Ian Boyden joins us today via Zoom from his studio on San Juan Island for our third interview together. One was with the late poet Sam Hamill at Spring Street Center. One was on San Juan Island at your house about the Ai Weiwei, no, it was at the museum about the Ai Weiwei exhibit. And Ian, it's just a delight to be able to talk to you about the new book, and huge congratulations.
Thanks, Paul. It's just, it's a real pleasure, and thanks for inviting me to be interviewed. I love talking with you. It's
my delight to do that. But to get a sense of how a white guy from Oregon ended up becoming fluent in Chinese, that might be a good place to start.
Oh, the fates, the fates. When I was in high school, when I was growing up, I was really interested in Chinese, in calligraphy, Chinese calligraphy, Western calligraphy, things like that. And when I went off to college, I had this idea that I would become an anthropologist or an archaeologist or some sort of thing like that. And so I enrolled in French because I had to have pass a French proficiency exam to get into either one of those departments. And I signed up for it, and by some completely bizarre fluke, some sort of chance, I ended up being assigned first-year Chinese. And I was completely flummoxed by this. I ended up, sort of sitting there around going, what the hell am I going to do? I decided to go down and introduce myself to the Chinese teacher because, I always kind of believe that when something odd lands in your lap, it's best not to say no right away. It's best to see if you can say yes. And I went down and I talked to her, and it just became really enamored of this teacher. And the very next year I was living in China, studying first at the Beijing Teachers College in Beijing, and then at Nanjing University.
This is at Wesleyan University, yes?
Correct, yeah. Wesleyan in Connecticut.
Mm-hmm. And then the time in China was thanks to a Watson Fellowship?
Yeah, so I studied for a year in China, went to Taiwan as well. And then when I graduated from college, I ended up with a Watson Fellowship to return to China to study the early history of Chinese writing as inscribed in stones. So the trajectory of my studies really, I still kept that anthropological interest, and it shifted really into the field of paleography. So real interest in the early history of Chinese writing and Chinese calligraphy. And so that Watson Fellowship was really one to go to China to look at the early history of Chinese writing as inscribed on stone. There's lithic monuments all over China, standing steely to words cut directly into the faces of cliffs. And then to, at the same time, meet with contemporary Chinese calligraphers and talk to them about their calligraphy that is inspired by those ancient calligraphic written forms that are found all over the Chinese landscape.
In petroglyphs?
Yeah, they're petroglyphs. They're a direct lineage with petroglyphs.
Fantastic. Very interesting. And you're a young man, so you're what, 20 some years old?
Yeah. Yeah, I first moved to China when I was 19. I started studying Chinese when I was 18. moved to China when I was 19. And then I was 22. I don't remember how old I was when I got the Watson Fellowship, and used that. And I traveled all over China at that point. And then I came back. I went to grad school again to get a degree in Chinese painting and calligraphy, and it continued my interest there. That interest really dovetailed into all sorts of aspects of my life. I became so interested in the arts of ink making, brush making, paper making, the systems of language, and even some early translation work that began at that point. So that was really sort of a very generative time in my life for a lot of the interests and themes that appear in this book.
Our friend Sam Hamill's poem Habitations went into a little bit of your process, and that's directly talking about you. And that's how we met. How you got connected with Ai Weiwei might be an interesting way to continue this interview. So tell us about that.
It's a very interesting story for me, at least. When I went to China in 1990, I took with me a book of poetry by a poet named Ai Qing. Ai Qing was one of the great socialist poets of the 20th century China. Kind of burst into the scene in the late 1920s, early 1930s as a rebellious voice, and quickly rose up through the ranks of the Chinese Communist Party. Was at Yan'an, became, friends with Mao Zedong. He was this kind of amazing individual. And then he fell out of favor, and he was banished to do hard labor in a work camp, first in far northwest China, and then way out in what is today Xinjiang. And I had a teacher when I was growing up named Tom Crawford, who was a wonderful poet, a wonderful Oregon poet. And he really looked after me in certain ways. He really understood that the kind of mind that I have was something that was really going to be a struggle, and that there was a poet lurking inside of me somewhere. And he fed me book after book after book. And when he found out that I was going to China, he said, you really should know this person. If you like Nazim Hikmet, I was reading a lot of Nazim Hikmet at that time, and a lot of Neruda. He said, if you like those two, he said, these are the three socialist poets, and you really need to, that you really need to go to school on. And so I did. And I remember I took that first book. I took that book with me. It was a I can't remember who translated it at the moment. I'm sorry. And I showed it to my Chinese teacher at Nanjing University. And I said, Miss Wei, I'd really like to, study Chinese by reading this poet. And she just couldn't believe it. An American bringing Ai Qing to China to read. How is this possible? But she agreed. And I taught myself Chinese by reading his poetry in part. At that time, I didn't know, it never even occurred to me that he had a family. I never thought to ask if he had children or anything like that. But later, I discovered that he is the father of the artist Ai Weiwei. And that just kind of blew my mind. I just kind of loved that, and I began to really study Ai Weiwei's art, and really began to understand it as a form of poetry, as a poet. This is a mind that was really shaped so clearly by a poet. And if you look at Weiwei's work from that standpoint, you can just begin to see all the layers of metaphor and working in his work that have, very distinct poetic sensibilities. So in 2015, I began working at a museum and that's out here on San Juan Island. And I thought, I'd really like to do an exhibition that looks at the real danger of a massive earthquake. We sit right on top of the Cascadia subduction zone, one of the most dangerous subduction zones in the world, and we're long overdue for a massive earthquake. And when I look around, I really don't see that we are prepared for that. And it was at a time when my own practice was really changing a lot, and I really wanted to see if I could use the arts as a way of creating some sort of dialogue. There's some sort of social practice that was needed, that it wasn't just some sort of constantly self-referential thing that occurs so often in American arts, especially. So I wrote to Ai Weiwei. He was under house arrest at that time in Beijing. I think a lot of us really wondered if he was ever going to be released. We didn't really know what his fate was going to be. And despite that, being under house arrest, he was organizing exhibitions, at the Hirshhorn and at the Tate and in Alcatraz, all these huge monumental shows, and really kind of taking the entire art world by storm. And I thought, well, he's doing that, but my motives for this show are very much in line with the motives that I believe that he was producing that work for, or in line with that. And so I wrote to him, and to my amazement, he said yes. And so we were able to organize this exhibition, and it contained 3 pieces, a video, all of which dealt with the Sichuan earthquake. I wanted to use his work with the earthquake to bring attention to the earthquake dangers here. So I had a video called Little Girl's Cheek, a piece which is called The Student Names, the names of the student victims of the Sichuan earthquake. I can't remember exactly what the title of that piece is, but it's a giant wall of names of 5,196 names of children that were killed in that earthquake. And then there was a third piece, which was called Rebar and Case, and that's 9 boxes, these beautifully crafted boxes. You open them up and you expose these marble facsimiles of rebar that was iron rebar that had been pulled from these collapsed schools. And these pieces of rebar are absolutely immaculate, right? Yes, there you have it, right on the cover of my book.
Right, so the cover of the book has that, and so people can get a sense that this comes directly from the exhibit that we're talking about.
Exactly.
And it also kind of looks like a spine.
Yes, yeah. And that's intentional. On my part, that's intentional. Weiwei, I don't think would say outright that it's intentional, because that's not what he does. But when you open those cases and you look at those pieces of marble inside them, it's virtually impossible not to understand Rebar and Case as a set of coffins containing the crumpled skeletons. And I found it impossible to overcome that. I think it's one of the most beautiful material transformations that I know. Iron, which is so dense, and it's like the heart of the earth, and it's malleable, and it's so heavy, was then transformed into something incredibly light and incredibly fragile. And of course, marble has, this monumental quality as well. It's what we use to make the headstones, to make sarcophagi, all these things. The marble itself that was used in carving those pieces is actually the same marble that was used in carving, or in putting together Mao Zedong's mausoleum in Tiananmen Square. That's not an accident, and so and this is why I say he has such poetic sensibilities. He's using the same materials. The moment that you know that particular detail, you can't ever look at those pieces the same way again. They become a real statement about how the state interacts with the individual. How do they view the dead? How do they treat the dead? What is that relationship between the individual and the state becomes part of that piece, and inextricable that way.
And given his own upbringing and his father being, a dissident, you can see how that as well informs his art, his poetics.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so as you are as you're hanging this show, as you're putting it together, there's a story about you being up on a ladder or something and having an assistant, and you're explaining the names, and then in the moment you're translating them because you're fluent in Chinese, and so you have some sense. She's seeing it, and I picture her as a she. I don't know. That's what I have in my head. And this is the genesis of the book.
Yeah, it was an amazing moment, Paul. When you put together a big exhibition, you always you set up time. You have to allocate X amount of time to do this part and this part and this part. And I had put together basically a day to hang that wall of names, and it turned out to be far more technically difficult than I had ever imagined it would be. And it took us a full 3 days to hang that piece. It arrived in 21 pieces of paper, each of which was 10.5 feet tall and 2 feet wide. And the only instructions I had was that the wall needed to be painted the same color as the paper, and that the paper needed to be mounted to the wall, so it wasn't hanging. Like, I couldn't just have it hanging and blowing around. It had to be mounted there with paste. It was the only way that I could see doing it. But the paper was very thin. It was like typing paper, and so instead of it being thick like most wallpaper is, where you have you can be pretty rough with it, this I had to be very, very delicate with. And I could only hang one sheet at a time and then move to the next and the next and the next. So it required absolute attention for a very, very long time, 3 full days, 10, 12, 14. I don't know how many hours we were working every day. No one else is in the museum. And it's just this quiet chamber, just with that intense energy of working going on, right? And as I did that, I was touching every single name. I was smoothing out the bubbles, the air bubbles underneath there, to get it so that the whole piece would dry and fit perfectly. And it became very emotional, because I was like, oh my God, and I had gloves on. Sometimes it was I just wanted to treat this object. It really felt like I was engaged in a form of a very deep ritual. And at one point I came to a name, I think it was First Glimmer of Dawn, maybe. I don't remember which name it was, and I just said it out loud, and my assistant was like, well, what did that name mean? And I said, well, it's a name which means, Zhengxi. It means First Glimmer of Dawn, and I just translated it right there in that very moment to her, and she's like, wow, that's beautiful. And then I was like, well, look at this next name. This is fantastic. Lacquer Cosmos, or Feather Snow. And we went on and on and on. And that became our conversation, was just literally me saying their names. I would say it in Chinese. I'd say my, attempted a translation there on the spot. Those names would kind of echo around the room of the museum and then go still again. It felt like I was hitting a bell, or, there was something about that which was just really, really magical. And it occurred to me at that moment that when I gave their names a meaning in English, that those kids suddenly became more real. They weren't just a name, they weren't just a number, a statistic in a sense. They became something other than that. So, a glimmer of dawn is much more evocative than number, 471 or whatever the, number was within that list. Or even more evocative than Zhengxi, which, that's what it means in Chinese, but you don't speak Chinese. And to be honest with you, most of us, when we're speaking anyone's names, it's just the sound of the name. Paul is just Paul. Ian is just Ian, right? Ian means something like Yahweh is gracious, but you're not saying that to yourself when you're talking to me, right? So I think that when we take apart a name and we actually render its real meaning, it changes our relationship to that which is named. And when we spend time to make it strange enough, to make it to dislodge that from the fabric of reality, the fabric of reality enough that we stop, then it allows for us to feel a certain amount of connection to that which is named, in this case, these children, despite the fact that they lived thousands and thousands of miles away, spoke a completely different language in, a world which is completely separate. And I think that it's so important for us to look at and to recognize the power of saying the names of these children, or saying the names of really anyone who has encountered the loss of dignity due to some tyrannical aspect of culture. And I think that's part of our current movement in the United States, of saying their names as well.
Yeah, the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So could you read a poem or two from the book so those unfamiliar with the work can get a sense of what you're doing? I picked out page 19, June 27, double pair to start with. So maybe that's one, and feel free to read what you'd like to read.
Sure. So that poem is for a child named Shuang Shuang, who was born on June 27th. Double pair. She dreamt of a tree and woke to two birds nesting in her left hand and two in her right. I mentioned that first name, that first glimmer of dawn, and that's actually the first poem that's in the book. This is a child who was born on May 13th, so this is the day right after the earthquake. So Zhengxi, first glimmer of dawn. Even the moon was shaken. How the dust settled so quickly. The people looked to where the sun should rise, waited as if it were an offering. They held the place where they thought their heart should be, though there was no proper place. Stones, parts of buildings, papers scattered like leaves. It must be winter, but the trees say it is late spring. The horizon of her name, dark blue, but fading.
These poems just tear your heart out. They're just, the whole thing just tears your heart out. And I mean, if I get fixated on it, I'm just going to lose it. So let me just go to the next question I had thought about. And that is, one of the things you discovered while translating the names is that many of them are divinatory in nature. So elaborate and talk about how that affected the composition process.
So where to start with this? I think that there's so many of the names in the book are divinatory. They are drawn from texts like the I Ching. And I think that all naming on a certain level is a form of chance. I mean, even Ai Weiwei, when I talked to him at one point about names and his own name, said, that when he'd asked his father about it, his father said, "Oh, when you were born, I opened up a dictionary and I pointed, and that was the character that my finger landed on. So it was a form of chance that was there, and that's a very interesting thing. I think there's an incredible amount of power to chance operation, and to the extent that chance operation is a form of divination, of course, right? The watching a bird's arc through the sky, casting sticks, the broken and unbroken lines of the hexagrams, all those types of things. And one of the powers of that type of activity is that so much of the way in which our thought process works is that we call the very next thing into being by what it is that we're saying, so that we're actually already on a sluice that we can't really get out of from the very beginning of a thought. But if you have a die and you roll that die, or you pull sticks of yarrow out of a thing to see who gets the longest or the shortest ones, that disrupts that process. And if you have a secondary book which you then turn to, and there's a text there that is unrelated to the thought that you had initially, the power of disruption in there oftentimes opens up a little wedge in our reality, right? So when I say reality, I'm not saying like it's all real, Paul. I'm saying that it's just a form of reality. It's culturally produced, right? There's an American reality. There's an American corporate reality. There's a Cascadian reality. There's a reality to English, reality to China. All these different forms of reality are there. And oftentimes those things are prisons, right? And so we have to like find ways in which we open them up, and we pull them apart, and we can our mind can slip through there and into something else. So it's like a parallel universe. And that inside of that, oftentimes we can bring back some sort of jewel that allows for us to understand, see our world in a different way, or understand ourselves in a different way. And I really feel like a lot of these names, in a sense, function in that way, and they certainly did for me. They contain images which I don't have in my daily life. Oftentimes they're pieces of language that English just doesn't have, so that you become aware of it. I began to understand them almost like visualization sutras. They were things which really could guide my mind in meditation, and that was an unbelievable gift. It was I found myself again and again sort of battling with both the incredible sadness of this event and what that name list means, the implications of it, and what I began to feel was an amazing gift of language, of imagery, to me, and just really wanting to honor that gift through the writing of these poems, and in so doing, then honor those children.
Can you elaborate on that phrase, visualization sutra? That was a question I had meant to ask you about. And for those who might not have a meditation practice, it might be nice for you to draw a picture for us.
So there's a long history of visualization, what are known as visualization sutras in the Buddhist tradition. And in the 4th, 5th century in particular in China, you began to see these texts that would emerge, and they give you a set of images, a sequence of images to try to focus your mind. So it might be an image of a tree, or an image of fire, or an image of ice, some sort of singularity to calm the mind down. Sometimes they were associated with a set of questions or some sort of thing like that. And they were very, very popular, and they've really formed a kind of one of the pillars within the Zen tradition in particular, I think, which at its root is meditation, means meditation. And so I spent a lot of that year writing this book from a cushion. I would wake up in the morning. Ai Weiwei was at that point tweeting out the names of the children every single day on the day of their birthday. So I would have a list of 3 to maybe 15 names or something like that. Every once in a while there'd be some sort of aberration where you'd have 30 or 40 names in a day. But I would read through that set of names. I'd choose 1 or 2, research those names, and once I had an image in my head, I had a set of images, I would then go and I would just sit. And I'd sit there for 30 minutes, usually 20, 30 minutes, whatever that morning would allow, what kind of gift of time that had, and still my mind around those images. So just really trying to sit with them and see what would come forth, what would come out. what kind of connections would I make in that period of time. And then when I was done, I would sit down and then write that piece down into Twitter. And at that time, it had a 140 character limit. So it drove this incredible amount of concision. I would oftentimes battling, I think humans are very verbose. We want to talk and talk and talk. And, that character limit for me was just wonderful. It's kind of similar actually to setting, language with lead type, handset lead type, right? It's really arduous, and it you kind of want to shorten it. And I was really interested in that. And for as much as these social media platforms drive me crazy, I thought that the conditions of Twitter were absolutely essential to this project coming into being and taking the form that it did.
In China, families can only have one child, and your one child dies in an earthquake. I mean, it's unspeakably tragic. How well known is that fact, do you think? And talk about how that colors the project.
So just a clarification, how well known is what?
That policy, and that do Americans know that in China you're allowed only to have one child? I don't know.
I think that's pretty well known. I'm not, actually, to be honest with you, I don't know how well known it is. I encourage everyone to watch, A Little Girl's Cheek. There's a wonderful website where all those videos are aggregated to really, you can see interviews with the parents and see the interviews with all sorts of people who were affected by this. It's an unbelievable tragedy. I think it's a parent's worst nightmare to lose a child, regardless of how that child is lost. And this particular tragedy was that much worse because instead of the state coming in and creating conditions that were conducive for collective mourning and collective grief, I think they actually added a second tragedy on top of it. So by making that subject taboo, then people couldn't talk about it. There couldn't be a collective discussion, and people couldn't honor that death in a way that was somehow separate from the state. I don't believe that our deaths, our individual deaths, should be the property of the state. I think that's incredibly wrong. And it is an assault on dignity. And so one of the things that happens through the grieving process is that we get to really think about that person, and we are able to steward their kind of the final stage of their being and their final stage of their dignity. And for the person who's died is dead. They're moving into the next dimension. Whatever belief system you have, it doesn't really matter. But those of us who are still living, we're left holding them in some way or another. And so that process is a way of giving us a means for holding them as we go forward. And honoring that. And I think that a lot of when we talk about things like dignity with regard to dying and with regard to how we remember the dead, that's a very personal thing that the state really should not have anything to do with.
We talked a little bit about Buddhism. Dogen is also a figure who sort of lurks behind or underneath or somewhere within these poems. Can you speak to Dogen?
Dogen is a person of just immeasurable genius. He was a 13th century poet and priest and writer, founder of Soto Zen, and is a person who's been I've been very, very interested in over the last few years because of his relationship to language. And I think that part of his dharma really had to do with language itself. And there's something very interesting that occurs in when you begin to learn a second language. So you have your primary language, you learn your world, you grow up, the language and the world are inseparable. Your whole cultural sphere is kind of one very tightly knit entity. And then as soon as you learn a second language, parts of that world begin to unravel. And you begin to see, oh, look, there's a word for, for sunrise, or the pink color of sunrise, where in English that was 3 or 4 words. In this language, it's just 1 word. And so you have to kind of part apart that little bubble of reality that you have, and you insert that character in there. And then, things become close knit again. And so learning a second language is a really wonderful way of loosening up the tight hold that language has on how we view and understand our world. And then when you have a philosophical tradition like Buddhism come in, it has a whole set of vocabularies that are completely foreign. And you have to now open up your reality to incorporate those bits of new thought. And for that to happen, for that to occur, there have to be translators. There have to be people who are actively translating from one language into the next, right? So in China, these were people who were interested in Sanskrit and Prakrit and a host of Central Asian languages, and they were taking those concepts and those words and they were bringing them into Chinese, right? And in some cases, they just created new words. In some cases, they grabbed old words, which were very similar in meaning. And they created this kind of wonderful new body of language, which is existing within the existing body of Chinese, right? And when Buddhism then moved from China to Japan, the same process happened, right? So you've got this thing which is moving now into this other language. And the same thing when it moves from China and Japan to America, again, a whole bunch of translators are sitting there right now, right? We're living in that moment, introducing a new language into English. And that's really changing the way in which we perceive our world, the way in which we understand our reality. So one of the reasons that I'm so interested in Dogen is that for me, the experience of translating and really devoting myself to a lot of Buddhist terminology, Chinese Buddhist terminology, is that it's completely changing the way in which I relate to language. And there's a certain thing that I can see in Chinese because of the distance that I have from Chinese that a lot of my Chinese friends don't have. And they keep asking, how did you arrive at that? And I'm like, well, because I see it like this. And then they're really surprised and they're like, wow, that's kind of far out. And it's leading me to write poems like what you have in the book, in the Forest of Names, right? A friend of mine, Yang Lian, who's a Chinese poet, when he read these poems, he wrote to me and he said, Ian, you discovered China's shortest poems, our own names. It took someone from outside the tradition to actually be able to identify the fact that these were even poems, that they actually existed as poems. And that's kind of an amazing gift, right? It's a beautiful thing that it's that great distance that sometimes allows us to see something for what it is, or I don't know if that's the right term for it, right? So when I read Dogen, right, what I see is a mind 700 years ago that's doing something very similar to me. And he's someone who I really aspire to because what he did with language is just utterly mind-boggling. So that's a long answer to what was kind of a short question. I'm sorry.
Well, it's really interesting. I don't mean to go from Dogen to sake, but there's the sake Kaze no Mori, and I have it with Bill Porter, and he said, Wind of the Forest. And I said, how can you tell? And he says, right there, the characters. I said, oh, yeah. And I said, here it says The name of it is Wind of the Woods. He said, that's a better translation. And then I bring it to you a few days later, and you're like, no, Wind of the Infinite Forest, I think is how you said it.
Infinity of trees, probably.
Or an infinity of trees. That's right. Wind from an infinity of trees. So just from that little example, I see how the different shades come up. So just even in drinking, these issues come up. Of course, it doesn't really work the same when drinking IPA, so that we stick to Sutra.
I think it's a wonderful example that you just gave. I mean, for one, what better time to really talk? I mean, language is so wonderful when you're drinking, right? It inspires everyone to talk. Everyone loves to talk. And there we had that little phrase, right in front of us, and it's inspired 3 radically different conversations. You know, and it really depends on kind of what your disposition is that you're arriving at, that you're coming from to arrive at that particular translation. You know, for me, I think that within Chinese, there's an incredible fascination with the infinite, and so when I see something like Sen, that's the character that you were just referring to, I immediately see that as one manifestation of that expression of the infinite. Yeah.
You've talked ritual in this interview, and in the past you've talked about a 1996 hike you took to the headwaters of the Min River, river which flows through the earthquake zone. And I think you might have said this in a previous interview, but you envision going there with the poems on individual pieces of paper, fold each piece of paper into a paper boat and sail them down the river. That's not going to happen, is it?
The chances of that happening are fairly slim. Yeah.
Because you're not in the good graces with the Chinese government, are you?
No, I haven't been for quite a while. I've never actually talked about that idea in an interview. I believe that was a letter. I think that's a letter that I wrote to you. And in 1996, this is when I had the Watson Fellowship. I traced the path of the Yellow River up to one of its sources. And one of the main tributaries of that river is the Min River that you just mentioned. And that flows right through Wentran and Beitran. And then up north and cuts right up into the Tibetan Plateau. This big gorge, this great big valley that's there. And I really wanted to just go and walk all the way there. And I hired a guy in Wentran, actually, or in Beitran. I don't remember where I hired the guy. We'd had lunch, and then I said, the next morning, can you do this? And he said, yeah. So he drove me up to where this river went off into this valley. He stopped the car, and I hiked in on foot until it was just all little springs and stuff coming out of the water, out of the ground. And I sat there and I drank from them, and I just had this wonderful day. So this would have been 1996, 2008. So it's 12 years before the earthquake happened. Of course, I had no idea that I actually wasn't sure I would ever come back to that space or ever think about it again. Who knew? I did that, and then I went back and I found him, and we drove back down to Chengdu, and that was the sum of that experience. And then when I started writing these poems, it took a little while before I realized and I remembered that day. And I was like, oh my God, wait a minute. All these kids grew up along the Min River. And, I'm tracing it out on the map, and I'm looking, and I found the exact spot where I'd been sitting, and I drank from the water. And then I had this overwhelming experience, this overwhelming sensation that it was that little bit of river that I had drunk and that had become part of me on that day that was somehow guiding me in the writing of these poems. And this is a feeling that I've had over and over in my life, that I am somehow, I am all these elements of my environment, and that I might just be a voice, you know, that like a mouthpiece for them. And I don't know how to explain that other than that. So what I'd love to do if the opportunity ever arose would be to come and take these poems and go back up to that headwater and just simply give those poems back to the river itself, you know, put them onto some sort of paper, fold them up as boats, sail them down that river, make a little movie out of that or something, you know.
May it be so.
Yeah.
The book is limited to 108 meditations, but that was for space considerations. There are considerable more than that.
Yeah, there are 306. The year that I wrote it was a leap year, so I wrote 366 poems. There's actually more than that because there were a few days when I felt particularly inspired, and I wrote more than that. But when I edited it, I turned it into a 366 poem manuscript, and that's what I was sending out. When Wesleyan accepted that manuscript, they did it on the condition that I shorten it to 80 poems, I think is what they had hoped for. I wasn't really very interested in that. And it caused me quite a bit of pain as I thought about taking that manuscript and then cutting it again. It felt violent to me, and that's unnecessarily violent. And then as I realized that it would also be really violent not to allow for this book to go out into the world, and especially, because Wesleyan has such a wonderful history. The very first book of poetry that I truly fell in love with is James Wright's The Bough Might Not Break. That's a Wesleyan book. I was like, well, I need to honor that too. There's something there. And so I began to really think about, if I were to shorten it, what would make sense? And that's when I hit on 108, because of course that's a number which has tremendous significance inside of Buddhism. 108 is sort of the sum aggregate of our emotional experiences. There's an elaborate mathematics to that I don't need to go into right at the moment. And 108 is divisible by 12, so that allowed for me to give equal representation across each month to keep that cyclical nature of it. And to fill everything out, I've been posting, all of the poems that don't appear in the book, then I'm posting those to Twitter as this year unfolds.
One of those that's not in the book, and that's September 22nd, which is a holy day around the Casa del Colibri here on it has a great story, a great background about a pine tree in the Okanagan that's still standing.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know I think I'm sure it's still standing, but whether it's alive or not, I don't know.
Because of fire. So September 22nd, I don't know if you have that handy, and maybe I should have given you a...
Yeah, I do. I have it right here. So September 22nd, Lin Chun, Forest of Simple Honesty. I raise my glass to those simple roots. May they wedge apart the foundations of complicity.
So that sounds pretty straightforward when one hears it. However, like any brilliant poetry, there's a backstory that can go on for a long time. How that image, or what the poet might have, where that poet might have gotten that image is what I'm trying to say. So the tree in the Okanagan is what you alluded to, maybe in an email with me or maybe in an interview. I'm not sure exactly where, but talk about that.
So as you know, the last month here in the Pacific Northwest has just been incredibly brutal with regard to forest fires. Valley after valley has burned. The day that my book was released, the little river valley where I grew up caught on fire. My mom was calling me in a panic. The Mackenzie, the Beachy fire. I mean, it's just one place after another, these catastrophic, massive fires. But one particular fire up in north central Washington ended up burning my friend Jay Goldmark's family's ranch in the course of just a few hours. 8,000 acres, their houses, everything just went up in smoke. And it's just incredibly heartbreaking. These fires are just, they're just growing in size. And I called him right away, and we were talking. I was like, my God, do you know if the Lone Pine, did it make it? And Jay, who's, currently living on the East Coast, said, I haven't had the heart to ask my brother yet. And the Lone Pine is a tree that it's so absolutely incredible. This ranch sits up on top of a plateau, and the plateau is covered in giant glacial erratics. So stones the size of a house, okay? And they dot this landscape, and Jay's family's been farming it for years, and every spring and autumn they plow around these stones, and they plant it with weed, and it looks like a giant Japanese rock garden, right? It's just this amazing space. And right out on the very edges of it, there are a few trees, and one of them is this Lone Pine. And when you get up to the Lone Pine, there's something there that you just won't believe. This tree, this giant pine tree, has split apart a glacial erratic. And somehow, 100, 200 years ago, I don't know how old this tree is, a bird or, a marmot, some sort of animal came and they hid a pine seed down in a little crevice in this stone. And the environment is so harsh that really no tree should have ever been able to grow there. But that little tiny crevice was enough shelter that it allowed for that seedling to sprout. And there was a little tiny crack in the stone, and there was enough moisture there. All this, the tree began to grow, and the roots went down to that crevice, and they grew a little bit, and they forced the stone apart just a tiny, tiny bit. And then maybe that winter there was some water that got in there, and the ice forced the rock out a little bit more, and it gave more space for the roots to grow down and expand. And every season was like this, and it just kept going until today that rock has been cleaved, and the two halves are many feet apart from each other, and growing out of them is this giant, beautiful ponderosa pine. It's the most amazing thing. And I've sat there for many years and thought, this tree is a teacher.
The way your mind works when you describe that gives us a sense into your poetry and into your artwork. And it's just absolutely fascinating, the combination of science and imagination and your ability to describe. I think reading the poem from the 22nd again, now that people know the backstory, might be an interesting experience. Could you do that?
Of course. September 22nd, Linchun, Forest of Simple Honesty. I raise my glass to those simple roots. May they wedge apart the foundations of complicity.
All over the world, from your lips to the ears of the great mystery. And this leads me perfectly to my next question, because I think it was here at this table right over here, we were talking about a granular approach to making art. And you have gone into central Washington and or eastern Washington and recovered carbon from forest fires. You were doing that perhaps in Oregon, or had the mind to do that at the fire near your boyhood home in Oregon. When you talk about the granular, I'm thinking in language, Charles Olson's notion of listening so scrupulously, you're listening syllable by syllable to the work, or maybe even shorter than that because of the assonance in a lot of work that I'm interested in. So a granular approach, talk about that. And did you get any carbon in Oregon?
You know, I collected some material while I was in Oregon, and I have a guy there who's going to be collecting some fairly large pieces of wood for me from those fires. So yeah, every trip is a chance to gather materials like that. I think that the material contains mind. And when we gather it from our environment and we give ourselves over to it, we can allow the mind of that material to work on our own. So instead of imposing our own mind upon that material, allow the mind of that material to impose itself upon our own. And I really, that's for me an incredibly important part of the way in which I work. How do I get myself out of the way of the ideas themselves? I know that runs contrary to a lot of branding and, you know, things that are really important in so-called American arts. But it's never been all that important for me. How to describe the granular? Maybe I would describe it from an experience I have with taking photographs. I've for several years been interested in the aftermath of a huge forest fire up in north central Washington that was called the Tripod Complex Fire. And this is a fire that at the time of its burning was the largest forest fire in Washington state history, recorded history. It burned 189,000 acres of forest. And it burned for months. And it just laid waste to this incredible environment up there. And I happened upon it kind of by surprise, and it really captured my imagination. I've been going back there every single year, collecting carbon that I make paintings out of, taking huge numbers of photographs, collecting carbon, which I then turn into ink to print those photographs. Here, I'm just going to turn this for a second. So you can see that's one of those, that's a photograph of one of those trees printed with carbon from that tree. And as I do that, you become very interested in sort of the granular qualities of the photograph itself and the granular qualities of perception itself. And you know, spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to create the greatest depth of field and all these different things that concern photographers. And then I moved out here. I went through a big disruption in my life, and I kind of lost track of that idea. And I was a little worried about it. And then I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go back. I'm just going to go back up into that mountain and see what happens. And I got up and I was sitting up there. I was looking around, when I realized that absolutely everything in the world is in focus. Everything is absolutely sharp, all the way down to the most microscopic level. It's only our eyeballs that have anything to do with focus. So focus is something completely, that's part of our own perceptual experience. It has nothing to do with reality itself. The whole world is in focus. And as I was having that epiphany, right, as I was having this epiphany, over the top of this ridge came this giant storm. And this huge storm is like blowing down toward me. And I'm like, oh man, I am going to get wet. And fortunately I had all these, you know, I had thousands of dollars worth of camera gear and equipment with me, but I brought these plastic bags and I wrapped everything up. And then I just sort of sat, you know, at the edge of this cliff waiting for the storm to pass, when suddenly the storm, giant lightning bolts start to come out of the storm. And I realize that I'm, you know, right at tree line and I'm exposed, and the hair on my arm starts to like lift off straight. Like I can feel myself caught in this gigantic charge, gigantic electrical charge of the storm. And I thought, oh my God, like, did I say goodbye? Like, did I have or my things in enough order? I don't know what I'm thinking. And so I just like pressed myself up against this cliff face and lightning is going all around. And then to my amazement, about 300 feet away from me, I watched a lightning bolt come down and blow apart a tree. And I couldn't believe it. I'd been struggling to revitalize this project in my head. And the storm just came, and it gave me the image of how that original fire started. The tripod complex fire was originally started by lightning, a lightning storm just like this. So I just sat there and I watched that, and then the storm passed. I went over and inspected this tree. I just couldn't believe it. It was such an amazing object, you know, and I circled all around it, and I took a couple photographs of it. And then I said, well, I better, you know, walk back down to my truck and go to my camp, you know, and I started walking back down, and I realized, I was like, wait a minute, what am I doing? I need to go and collect that tree. I need to get all the shards from that tree. So I put away all my camera equipment in my truck, got out a backpack with a bunch of straps, and I went back up like a woodcutter of old, and I gathered this humongous bundle of shards. And it took 2 trips. And on the second trip when I was there, this little thrush, a hermit thrush, was sitting inside, right on top of that tree that had just been blown apart by lightning. And it was singing its heart out. It was just like singing and singing and singing. And it was so astounding to me, because there was this song was so pure. And I saw it, I heard it as a form of thunder. And I thought, there's a form of lightning inside of that thrush. There's some sort of lightning that's happening there, which is resulting in this thunderclap of its own song. So I got a field recorder, I recorded that song, and then I used that to generate a piece where I made the waveform of that thrush singing out of the shards of wood from that burned tree. And I wanted to be able to speak to the spiritual truth of that, but I also wanted to be able to present it as a form of sort of that granular nature of reality. There it is. It's the actual material of it. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where my mind went.
You've said the fundamental question I've explored in my work over the past 15 years or more is this: what causes the illusion of our separateness from the environment and from each other? And can art function as a counter-argument, break down that illusion? I mean, you broke it down by answering that last question. I mean, taking us through that moment gave us a real sense that, yes, it can be a counter-argument, because you're creating an opportunity for transcendence in the person who hears that. I mean, I had this tremendous empathy for this little bird who's probably dead, who I'm never going to meet, and liken its song to a lightning bolt. I mean, if that isn't a transformational kind of thing, if that's not a transmission, I don't know what is. So in a way, the question, one of the last questions I wanted you to end with, you already answered in the question about the granular. However,
reading your mind.
However, should you have more to say about that notion of art being a counter argument from this notion of separateness, which we feel so strongly right now with a guy like, what's his name, in charge of the country?
Yeah. Well, he's a person who really has a very hard time, feeling any sort of unity with anything. So that's too bad. I do want to say that I think that art certainly plays a great role. I think the arts, literature, whether they're literary arts or visual arts, sonic arts, whatever they are, they do play a tremendous role in the way in which we understand our relationship to our world. And I think that the really important part in this is that they really only function well if we talk about them. And if we open ourselves up to the vulnerability of discussing them and what they, what they're doing to us, how they might make us feel, why they're being made. If you want something to live, you talk about it. And if you want something to die, just stop talking about it. And so what I think an artwork does is it creates a foundation upon which a conversation can take place. And I don't really want to direct those conversations any more than simply create the foundation upon which that might occur. Because I think that it's those moments of discovery that each person has that are truly transformative. So we have to be able to transform from within, because transformations that are being forced upon us typically don't stick very well.
The parents of the children who died in the earthquake are not going to know about this book or the poems, are they?
I don't know. I have a great belief that they will know. I think that information flows very much like water. It's really hard to get water out of anything, right? I mean, you really have to you have to have a lot of silicone to do that. And even then it doesn't work. And I think that ideas are the same way. They flow around. I have multiple friends from Sichuan province. They still have family there. I have friends in China that have translated a bunch of these poems. They've been published in underground publications. I believe that there will be, I believe that some of these poems are going to make it. I have to. What they'll look like at that point, I don't know, but it won't be something that's easy.
They have to be translated into Chinese.
Well, that's what I love. I have a friend in Beijing who I've translated a bunch of these poems with. There's a woman who's recently started translating several of them on Twitter. And it's just utterly fascinating to me. These are poems which on some level are translations from Chinese. We haven't even talked about translation, but to have them go back into Chinese is just really fascinating. I have several Chinese friends who very blithely sort of say, well, poetry is dead. Now is not the age of poetry, and I'm like, how can you be saying that, and in some respects it's because, the language of the Tang Dynasty and the Song Dynasty, it's an absolutely foreign language, right? It's just like Old English is a foreign language. We can't understand it very easily. So sometimes it's actually much more easy to understand something in translation, from English than it would be to actually read the original in classical Chinese. So I think there's potentially a small generation, of poets who are actually going to school on ancient Chinese poems, but through the translation of those poems in English and, other languages.
Hence the popularity of Red Pine.
Yes. Yeah, yes. Absolutely.
Ian, you're endlessly inspiring. We could talk about the spine of axes behind you. We could talk about so many things, but probably good time now to stop and to express my thanks and admiration and just love of you and all that you do.
Thanks, Paul. I just love talking with you. I wish you were here in person. You're just, you bring out good stuff with everyone that you talk to. Just really a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, brother.
Yeah.